The ground itself trembled as a wall of French knights charged forward. They were the ultimate warriors of their age, clad in steel from head to toe. Yet on one afternoon in 1415, this pride of medieval Europe was utterly broken. It was the Battle of Agincourt, a single bloody day that shattered the myth of knightly invincibility. Think of these knights as the medieval equivalent of main battle tanks, an unstoppable force. Then picture the English longbowmen as a simple, devastating countermeasure no one saw coming. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how a humble piece of wood and string managed to topple the very pinnacle of chivalric power. What does it truly take for an underdog to rewrite the rules of war? A knight represented the peak of military engineering, a fortress on horseback. His suit of full plate armor was a masterwork of the blacksmith's art, capable of deflecting sword blows and lance tips with ease. Beneath him, his massive warhorse was a living engine of destruction, bred for power and trained for the chaos of battle. To become a knight was a lifetime's endeavor, beginning as a page at 7 years old and progressing through years of grueling training in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and the complex code of chivalry. This was not merely a profession, it was an entire social class, the bedrock of feudal power. On an open field, a charging knight was the closest thing to an unstoppable force the medieval world had ever seen. His very presence was meant to inspire awe and break the enemy's will before a single blow was struck, but this pinnacle of power had a price tag to match. The cost of a full harness of armor, a trained warhorse, and the retinue of squires and servants required to maintain it all was astronomical. A single knight's equipment could cost as much as a small farm produced in an entire year. This created a critical weakness, one that went beyond mere finances. The entire system was built for a specific kind of war, a head-on clash of noble champions on favorable ground. What happened when the battlefield was not an open field, but a narrow, muddy lane? The knight's greatest strength, his thunderous charge, became useless. His heavy armor, a lifesaver in a melee, could become a death trap in deep mud or against an enemy who refused to stand and fight. He was a precision instrument, devastating in the right conditions, but dangerously fragile and inflexible when those conditions changed. The question was not whether the knight was powerful, but whether he was still worth the immense cost. Was this elite warrior the key to victory, or was he slowly becoming a beautiful, overpriced relic, waiting for the right moment to be shattered? While the knight was a product of aristocratic wealth, England's answer was grown in the soil. The English longbow was not merely a weapon, it was a national institution. Crafted from a single, carefully selected stave of yew wood, this bow stood taller than most men, often over 6 feet in height. Its design was a marvel of natural engineering. The inner heartwood resisted compression, while the outer sapwood handled tension, working together to store a phenomenal amount of energy. To unleash that energy required a draw weight of around 150 pounds, a force that would be unimaginable to most people today. This was not a tool for occasional hunting. It was a machine built for war. Mastering it required a lifetime of conditioning, starting from boyhood. English law actually mandated longbow practice for all able-bodied men, creating a vast pool of highly skilled archers drawn from the common yeoman class. These men developed the specific muscles and skeletal deformities to prove their dedication, with thickened left arms and often crooked spines. Their training was relentless, a stark contrast to the knight's chivalric education. While a nobleman learned the arts of courtly love, the yeoman spent his Sundays loosing hundreds of arrows at distant targets. This was not a hobby, it was a civic duty that forged a professional soldier from the peasantry. On the battlefield, this combination of weapon and wielder created a storm of steel. A skilled longbowman could fire 10 to 12 arrows in a single minute, a rate of fire that would not be matched by infantry until the 19th century. At 200 yards, his arrows could pierce the mail armor worn by most soldiers, but to stop a knight, he needed something more. That something was the bodkin point, a long, slender, and sharply pointed arrowhead made of hardened steel. Unlike a broadhead designed to slice flesh, the bodkin was a needle, engineered to concentrate all the longbow's immense force onto a tiny area, punching through plate armor like a hammer driving a nail. This was not a random innovation. It was a direct and calculated response to the knight's greatest asset. The longbow transformed the battlefield from a stage for heroic duels into a deadly mathematical equation of range, trajectory, and penetration. It was a system that turned a nation's entire male population into a single, coordinated engine of destruction. But having the ultimate weapon is one thing. Using it effectively against the most powerful army in Europe is another. The true test would come not in a training yard, but in the mud and rain of a French field, where strategy would be just as important as raw power. King Henry V's campaign in France was a desperate gamble. He had led his small army on a brutal raid, a chevauchée deep into enemy territory, not to conquer land, but to simply burn and pillage, proving his right to the French throne through sheer audacity. Now, with his men sick, starving, and hundreds of miles from safety, his only goal was a desperate march to the English stronghold of Calais. The French nobility, however, had other plans. They mobilized a vast host, an army that outnumbered the English by at least 3 to 1, some say as much as 5 to 1. This was not just a military force. It was the flower of French chivalry, thousands of proud knights and men-at-arms, all gleaming in their polished steel. They were supremely confident, viewing the bedraggled English not as worthy opponents, but as insolent peasants to be crushed in a glorious, decisive battle. They intercepted Henry's exhausted column near the small village of Agincourt. The stage was set, but the battlefield itself would become the true architect of the coming disaster. It was a narrow strip of open ground, less than 1,000 yards wide, flanked on both sides by thick, impenetrable woods. This was not a wide, open plain ideal for a grand cavalry charge. To make matters worse, it had rained torrentially for days. The field, recently plowed for the autumn sowing, had been churned into a deep, cloying sea of thick, heavy mud. What looked like a perfect killing ground for the French knights was, in reality, a death trap. Their greatest weapon, the thunderous momentum of a massed cavalry charge, was about to be swallowed whole by the earth itself. The French, blinded by their own sense of superiority and their thirst for glory, did not see the danger. They saw only a tired, outnumbered enemy, cornered and waiting for the slaughter. The French commanders made a fateful choice. They ordered their knights to dismount and attack on foot. It was a decision born of necessity in the cramped space, but it was also a catastrophic miscalculation. These proud warriors, encased in steel plates weighing 60 pounds or more, now had to trudge forward not on firm ground, but through a near bottomless bog. Each step was a struggle, an exhausting effort to pull a boot from the clinging mud before plunging it back in. Their advance slowed to a painful, labored crawl. They were becoming exhausted before they even got within 100 yards of the English line. Across the field, the English archers stood ready. Before them, they had hammered sharpened wooden stakes into the earth at an angle, a simple but brilliant palisade that created a deadly hedge against any cavalry that might somehow break through. Then the command came. Thousands of longbows were drawn back in unison, the air humming with the strain of yew wood. The sky itself seemed to darken as a storm of arrows ascended in a high, arching trajectory. This was not aimed, precision shooting. This was area denial, a deluge of steel designed to rain down on the packed French formations. The effect was not merely lethal, it was psychologically shattering. Arrows clattered off armored plates, but they also found their marks. They thudded into the unprotected flanks of horses, sending the few remaining mounted knights crashing into the mud. They slipped through the visor slits of helmets or punched through the weaker armor at joints and armpits. The field became a nightmare of stumbling, wounded men. The knights who fell found it nearly impossible to rise again under their own weight in the deep mire, creating a churning, chaotic pile of men and metal. The French advance, already slow, disintegrated into a disorganized mob trapped in a killing zone. Then, as the arrow storm continued to pour down, King Henry gave his final order. His English men-at-arms, who had waited patiently, now surged forward. They were not weighed down by heavy plate, and they moved with agility across the torn-up ground. Alongside them came the archers, having expended their arrows, now wielding mauls, axes, and swords. They fell upon the exhausted, bogged-down French knights. The battle was no longer a fight. It was a gruesome harvest. Immobilized by mud and exhaustion, many French nobles could barely lift their weapons. They were systematically overwhelmed and cut down. The field of Agincourt, which was supposed to be a stage for French glory, had been transformed into a slaughterhouse, all in one bloody afternoon. When the mud settled and the cries of battle faded, the scale of the catastrophe was almost beyond belief. The French army, one of the largest and most powerful ever assembled, had been annihilated. Estimates suggest the French suffered between 6,000 and 10,000 casualties, a staggering number that included a significant portion of their nobility. The English, by contrast, lost perhaps a few hundred men. This was not just a victory. It was a rout of historic proportions, a mathematical impossibility that had been made brutally real. The longbow had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as the great equalizer of the medieval age. In a single afternoon, it had demonstrated that discipline, technology, and tactical intelligence could overwhelm sheer numbers and aristocratic might. The myth of the knight's inherent superiority was broken, left to rust in the fields of Agincourt. The long-term consequences rippled across centuries. While knights would remain on the battlefield for many years, their role was forever diminished. The era of the common soldier had truly begun. Armies would increasingly rely on trained professional infantry and missile troops, men whose value was measured in skill, not noble birth. This shift on the battlefield mirrored a slow but profound change in society itself. The power held by a landed aristocracy, justified by its military role, began to erode as kings realized they could build effective armies from a broader population. Agincourt stands as a stark reminder that no form of military power is permanent. It is a lesson in how innovation can topple giants and how a single, well-placed idea can change the course of history. So, what other underdog stories capture your imagination? What other moments where the established order was overturned by a brilliant new strategy or a simple, overlooked technology? Share your favorite historical turning points in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our world.